As regular people, this is probably what we're mostly concerned about. Something that arises from recessions and sticks around for a while after recessions. What would that be?
Unemployment.
Yes.
Unemployment.
Unemployment, yes, great. So let's look at that. So once again, US is in blue, Canada is in red, and this is the past about 30 years. So you can probably imagine that this is where we are now. Our unemployment figures in both countries are pretty high. Well, if you look at Canadian history, well, this is definitely not the highest we have seen in the past 30 years. For the US, it's getting there. It's getting to be one of the higher unemployment years that they have seen in a while. But, once again, this is not unprecedented, especially if you go as far back as the Great Depression, because during the Great Depression, unemployment rates were what? Around 25%, yes. So every fourth person was unemployed. So in terms of unemployment, this is definitely a pretty bad recession in both countries. By the way, they think that in the US, the recession has ended, right? Because they had 1 quarter of positive GDP growth. That was the last quarter. So officially for them, the recession is over. For us, it's unfortunately not, but we didn't have it as bad as they did, so probably hopefully we're just slowly recovering from a not so bad recession. But from the unemployment standpoint, this is definitely the bad times. From the financial market standpoint, yes, at one point during this financial crisis, I remember the headlines, we said, some of them said the world lost 40% of its wealth, right, in the stock markets. But you've seen the first picture that we looked at, we're slowly recovering from that. So, I don't know what you guys thought about what we just lived through, but it's not that horrible of a crisis, and we have definitely been there before, in one way or the other. Do we have any questions before we move on? No? Okay. So then let's move on. How did we get here? So, I decided to be creative and titled the next slide From the Great Moderation to the Great Recession. So let's figure out what these two mean. Actually, let's figure out what we already talked about the Great Depression, so I guess everybody knows what that is. There are two great periods in economics, right? The Great Depression, that was in the late 20s, lasted through the mid-30s of the previous century, and that was the really, really bad period of time, right? And then the Great Recession is what this recent recession is getting to be called, at least for now, so that's where we are now. What is the Great Moderation? Has anyone heard that one before? Yes?
Is it just a period of steady growth?
No, there actually were a couple of recessions there, but good try. Anyone else? There were a couple of recessions during the period of Great Moderation. And like what? The light recessions, not the really bad ones.
Well, maybe like depression, but like spread over time, so it's not as bad, but it's longer.
No. Okay, well, obviously you guys haven't heard this, so let me just tell you. The Great Moderation is a period from the early 80s up till this last period, up to this last recession, the Great Recession, during which economics as a science thought that they figured out how to fight business cycles, or economic cycles for that matter. Does this ring a bell now? Okay. So, sometime in the early 80s, economists all over the world, and the really, really smart economists all over the world, figured that now they sort of knew how to prevent recessions, or if recessions happen, how to fight them very effectively, with one instrument that's called what?
Monetary policy?
Right, with the monetary policy. And actually, they were quite successful, right? So, blah, 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 and at the head of all this was this guy. Well, he wasn't the only one, definitely, but he's probably the most known for this. What's this guy's name? Yes, this is Milton Friedman, one of the Nobel Prize winners in economics, one of the greatest minds of our times. He, in his life's work, proved in many, many ways that monetary policy, in other words, manipulation of what? Yes, through what? Yes. Can smooth out business cycles, or economic cycles, whatever you want to call them, right? And for the past, what is it, 30 years, almost 30 years, we have successfully done this, and this guy, hello, this guy is Alan Greenspan, successfully manipulated money supply, interest rates, to fight recessions for a very, very long period of time, right? So after this sort of became a common sense kind of thing that, well, you know, we can fight these recessions with monetary policy, people got kind of relaxed, right? Because, you know, if it's relatively easy to manipulate interest rates. Well, not easy, but for a large country like the US, for example, it is pretty easy. So why should we bother, right? Monitoring what's going on and preventing things. If it seems that monetary policy helps, right? So for the longest time, the Federal Reserve and its chairman, Alan Greenspan, believed that technically markets are efficient, and when they get a little bit out of whack, or a little bit out of hand, you can definitely help them out by either boosting them with low interest rates or slowing them down, or let's say lending them slightly nicely with higher interest rates. And this is actually how they fought that previous recession, the one that followed the internet bubble, right? There was a recession in the early 2000s that Federal Reserve and Alan Greenspan successfully fought. It was a very short recession. They successfully fought it with monetary policy. Now, what was that they sort of didn't do correctly, though, during that period of time? They did lower interest rates to help the economy recover from that recession, right? Or to make the recession shorter. But they didn't do what after the economy recovered? Yes.
They didn't raise interest rates.
Exactly. They kept them low, right? Why do you think they kept them low? Are they crazy? Are they, you know, Greenspan got kind of old by the end of this whole thing, right? Or maybe he just lost it. Why do you think they kept interest rates low for too long after the previous recession has been dealt with? Yes?
That boosts the market to the previous value that was before the recession. So they don't have achieved
Perhaps that was one of their reasoning points. But what else? How easy do you think it is to raise interest rates? And we're talking about the US, right? So how easy do you think it is to just get together and decide, okay, we're just going to raise interest rates because we think the economy has recovered? Not very, right? Because of... I'm sorry. Well, that was a consequence. Politics, right? It's quite difficult to convince interested parties that are definitely interested in keeping interest rates low, that it's time to actually raise them, right? So, for whatever reason, the Federal Reserve and Greenspan, as its chairman, didn't raise interest rates when they needed to, which led to mortgages. And what do we know about those mortgages? The recent crisis started with the housing industry, right? And the housing industry got in all this trouble because, and we're talking about the US, right? Because in Canada, there were no serious problems with housing, right? So it's the US originated crisis. Yes, so how do we make a link between low interest rates and the housing bubble that sort of started this whole mess? What is your name? I'm going to try to learn. Julian.
I think that was because they were selling everyone houses because they think housing market's going to go up. That's why they don't really mind. You can't pay your...
So low interest rates mean what? Low mortgage rates, right? Well, they don't have to mean this by default, but that's usually what happens, right? And low mortgage rates means that you can afford a house that you couldn't afford in the past, or otherwise, and that you can afford a bigger house that you wouldn't be able to afford otherwise, right? So low interest rates that resulted in low mortgage rates definitely boosted this whole housing industry, and since there was a lot of demand for houses, housing prices went up. And they went up for so long, actually they've been going up quite a bit for several